Jay Baba friends, we are so privileged to have Jay come and tell us. He's a great scholar. He's investigated the history. This came about because he came to Hanukkah programs, and he just tantalized us with a bit of his research on ancient the ancient Jews were with. Well, I will let him tell you. So proceed, Jay.
So, was it Elizabeth? Did you ask the question about how I work on this stuff and what I do? Uh, my my process for working on my India novels was to pick this very singular character, Shivaji, and the nature, who is a minor avatar, according to Mayor Baba, the minor avatar in advance of Baba's birth. The minor avatar sets up the social and political situation into which the avatar will be born. And this minor avatar, in order to understand some of the stuff that was going on, I had to study his current situation. And I couldn't study what was going on with his big enemy, the Moguls, until I found out something about the Moguls. And I couldn't figure out what was going on with him being a Hindu until I found out a little bit more about him being a Hindu. So then I started figuring out where the Moguls came from and what their religion was and where that all set up and how they invented Sharia law and all these things. I just got deeper and deeper in this tiny little area. In order to explore about 10 years, I had to go backward and forward about 500 years and into very many areas of Indian life. And the same thing is true when I thought I would like to study Judas Maccabees, because he sounds like the minor advent that preceded Jesus. And I'll bet he has an interesting story. So I just started looking it up. I knew of him, but I'd never looked into him. And the more I looked into it, the more complex the social structure was, the political structure, the banking structure, the relationship of the Romans to the Greeks, to Alexander the Great. It just began to open wide open. And all I wanted to do was study this one little event. Tell me about the battle that led up to Hanukkah. Tell me about Hanukkah. And I keep going hours and hours and miles in every direction. So I know a lot of stuff. It is researched. It is not, it is, I've read about it. Let me tell you how Wikipedia works. In Wikipedia, they say you can't do any original research. You just got to quote other people's work. You can't say, oh, I discovered radium or something. You just got to say, somebody said this, who discovered radium. You have to document it by somebody else saying it. So I have read many, many sources. I have no personal research that I've done, just reading books and websites and a bunch of other stuff. And my information is not guaranteed to be 100% date accurate or name accurate or anything, because I wasn't interested in being accurate. I was interested in learning how the people were, how they lived, what they were thinking, what their lives were like, how they interrelated, things like that. I was thinking about it in terms of being a novelist. So another thing I want to bring up is that when I talk about the Jews, I want to say that the Jews I'm talking about are in no way like the Jews of today. They are absolutely different in so many ways. So I may say things that sound very disparaging about those Jews because I have opinions about those Jews. I don't mean those opinions to be blanketed onto current Jews and current Judaism or anything like that. I just want people to have some idea of what happened in the past. The Old Testament Jews were guided by their understanding of their laws, by the words they were given by their prophets, and they really tried to do what they were told the best they could as they understood it. But after the temple was destroyed by Rome, after there were no more priests, after it became rabbis instead of priests, after Jesus had been born as Avatar and begun to reshape the world in his compassionate way, the Jews began to change as well. They've evolved, they've changed, and I'm not talking about modern Jews. I'm talking about Old Testament Jews, I'm talking about 2,000-year-old Jews, 3,000-year-old Jews. So please don't, in case I say something, please don't get antsy, okay? So I want to show you this. This is interesting to me. Remember Handel, the guy who wrote the oratorio, The Messiah? He wrote this. I don't know if you can see it. There we go, sort of.
Oh, it's
This
blurry.
is,
Can you get rid of the blur? Oh, there you are. Okay.
I don't know if you can see it. This is his oratorio, 3 hours long, Judas Maccabees. After he got done writing The Messiah, he looked around for what he was going to write, and the first thing he thought about was Judas Maccabees. There's something to write an oratorio about. So I just think it's interesting that people have been interested in this man's life and work and have a little bit of understanding. And I want to relate this also back to Hanukkah, which is why I'm here, which Maimonides said was the most important festival and ceremony in Judaism. And you got to ask yourself, how come he said that? And why it says in the Talmud that a man should sell his own clothes if that's what it takes to buy the oil for the lights of Hanukkah. Sell his own clothes. So I'm not the first person to think Hanukkah is a big deal. It's way more than artificial Jewish Christmas. It is serious stuff, and it has meaning for everybody, not just the Jews. It is a celebration of God in the world. And one of the things that happens is, one of the things you learn in the Talmud is that you are supposed to put the lights outside so everybody can see them, to let everybody know that this wonderful event happened. And they're not talking about a battle. They're talking about the blessings that came down out of nowhere. And so I always make a point of doing that. So I'm going to talk, and I'm going to start the talk.
Jay?
Yes.
Now, we do have one hand up. What would you like? Would you like people to save their questions, or
I've got Barbara here, and she'll probably tell me, kick me under the table and tell me I should wait for questions. But should I wait for a question? Anybody got questions?
got one. Elizabeth?
Yeah, I just have a very basic question,
Yeah.
and that is, why is it that you use the term Jews instead of Hebrews?
Because they're Jews. To
Well,
me,
I
they're
mean,
Jews.
the Hebrew nation. I mean, I guess my conception of it is it started out as, you know, the Israelites, and I thought they were called Hebrew. I know they're also called, the Jewish people, but anyway, I just thought I'd ask.
I apologize. A lot of people have brought up the fact that I say the Jews. And to me, it's perfectly normal. These are all people whose main thing that they have together is their Jewish religion. And in this story, as I tell it, it is their religion that is the main factor, not their nationality.
Okay.
So I don't mind calling them Jews, but I appreciate that, because, we got to be careful about what we say and how we say it and stuff like that. And I'm totally not. I will probably say a lot of stuff and swear too much before the night's done. So thank you for bringing it up, Elizabeth. Any other things?
I think I will ask, unless it's a burning question, just to save questions till, because I think you get on a roll.
I'm
Jay?
going to take breaks. And ask for questions.
All right.
I've actually got this thing written out in parts. Okay, so part one is the Jews in the temple. In order to understand Hanukkah, you got to understand the nature of the Jews of the time and their relationship to the temple. So I want to go back to where it started. The temple started back in Moses's time. After he'd gotten all his commandments, he had a bunch of commandments. There were a zillion things you were not supposed to do, and there were a zillion things you were supposed to do. And Moses tried to put this in place. And probably the most huge thing that he did was to create this traveling temple. It was a tent affair. It was a fence, a cloth fence that went around an altar and a big tent in the middle. It was they called a tabernacle. And in the middle of this tent was the Ark of the Covenant. Now they'd been carrying the Ark as the Jews carried the Ark out of Egypt, and actually they created it after they'd left. And what they did, why they had this ark, was they took the broken stone commandments that had been broken by Moses and put them in this box. And they put some of the manna that they'd been given, fed them in the desert. They put that in the box. And then when Aaron died, they put his staff in the box. So this is a box, and there's beautiful pictures of it. I 100% tell you to go take a look at them. They are gorgeous. If you saw the Raiders of the Lost Ark, they did a very good job of reimagining the Ark of the Covenant. And this box was being carried every day in front of the Jews as they left Egypt. And it would give out a pillar of smoke by day for everybody to follow. And at night, it was a pillar of fire, and they would follow that. It was one of the key elements of their escape from Egypt. And this traveling temple that Moses created, first thing they put in was the Ark of the Covenant. They also put into it the other things he told them to put into it, which was a menorah, a 7-branch menorah with oil lamps, and a showbread table. There were 12 loaves of bread that would be put on this table, one for each of the tribes. I'm assuming you know there's 12 tribes of Israel. They also had 2 altars, a gold and a silver altar inside where the priests would go and say stuff. And they also had a laver, I think I'm saying that right, which is a basin that they would wash their hands and feet in as they were preparing to do their little ceremonies. So this ark was placed in the main temple tabernacle, and it was very important for the Jews because this was the place where they could take care of their sins. The Jews of this time had no afterlife. There was no heaven, there was no hell. And when they sinned, there was immediate retribution from God. And God's retribution was one or all of 3 things: making them sick, poor, or dead. And if they sinned, God would not just punish them by being sick, poor, or dead. That punishment would continue on to their children, to their grandchildren, and their great-grandchildren, and the whole family would be punished because of the sins of one person. And it was immediate, and there was no way out except one. And that was what the temple was about. You could go to the temple and make an animal sacrifice. You could get an animal and burn it. And when you burned it, God would forgive your sin. So it was very important when you did something wrong to get to the temple as fast as you could, get yourself an animal and burn it. Oh, I can see at least one of us is shaking her head. But this is true. This is how you did it. There was no other way. There was no other way. It was automatic. And what Moses did was to set up this temple with the 12 tribes so that each tribe would have a responsibility for duration, like a month or a year. And the tribe's responsibility would be passed from tribe to tribe. So somebody was in charge of making all the cloth they had to replace cloth every year. So some tribe would be in charge of making all new cloth. There'd be you needed to have a constantly lit fire. So some tribe would be in charge grabbing wood for the fire and making sure it was lit all the time. Everything had been set up in a way that the entire tribe of Israel, all these people, each had a specific responsibility. And the whole responsibility was keeping the temple active, because unless the temple was active, everybody was subject to the immediate retribution for sins against God. It's amazing what a machine Moses put in place. And it just ran. It just ran. And the only people who didn't have a changing duties were the tribe of the Levites, which are the Levites, and they were the priesthood. And what they did was actually do the animal sacrifice and burning. They actually killed the animals, they actually burned them. And they got to keep 1/4 of whatever animal they had just basically roasted on the altar fire. And when they gave animal sacrifice, typically you'd have a small animal like a lamb or something like that. You would put it on the fire and roast it and then eat all the good parts. The priest would cut out the bad parts before they put it on the fire. There are certain parts which, according to the law, are impure. They'd cut out the impure parts. They'd put the pure parts on the fire. They would give most of the meat to the people who'd brought the animal for sacrifice, and the rest of the time, the rest of it would go to the priests. And the priests, that's how they made their money. They would sell it if they didn't need to eat it, and they would eat it if they needed to eat it. There are 2 other sacrifices that were done in the temple every day, and those were holocausts, which is where the word comes from. The Holocaust was the burning of a whole lamb and not taking any meat. You burned the whole lamb to ashes. They did that once in the morning, first thing in the morning. They did it at night, last thing at night. It was similar to Artie. It was the way you began and ended the temple day. So I think I'm done. Oh no, there's another couple things. Yom Kippur. There was a concern, and God set up a way to handle people who didn't know they'd done all these offenses. And to take the unknown, unforgiven offenses and expiate them for the entire tribe. So once a year, based on the requirements of the commandments, once a year, the high priest, the main Levite priest, would do a sacrifice on behalf of the entire nation. And he would get up and they do this thing where they had 2 goats. And they would take one goat and get it ready to sacrifice. They'd take the other goat, put a little ribbon on it, and then they would send it out into the wilderness to be sacrificed to Azazel. This is really hard to understand. This is stuff that I hesitate to say.
Maybe they know it.
Do you know about Azazel? Does anybody know about Azazel? Okay. Well, before Adam and Eve, there were angels with God, and there was a division, and Satan fell, and a bunch of angels fell to earth. And they became known as, you'll see them listed in places as giants. There were giants in the earth in those days. You might have heard that phrase. These giants were in the earth. They're basically sort of mini gods. And they still survived, and they'd still bug the Jews every once in a while. And Azazel was the main one that the Jews tried to placate. He lived out in the desert, and they would take one of the goats and slap it and try to get it to run into the desert, and they would wait until it fell into a ravine and died. And when it fell into a ravine and died, some guy who was watching it would chase back to the high priest at the temple and say, okay, do the sacrifice of the other. So they would sacrifice the other, and that sacrifice would be in for all the sins of all the Jews. Now, the interesting part about this is the high priest would then take blood from that goat and put it on a sprinkler or a little censer and go into the tabernacle, open up the what am I thinking of? The gates, the cloth that covered the Ark of the Covenant all the time, pull it apart, and you would typically see a little smoke coming out, and he would sprinkle the goat blood on the ark, and at that time would see a manifestation of the face of God. And when he saw that manifestation, he would know that the ceremony had worked right, and he would return, and he'd say it all worked, and everybody'd cheer and sing and all that stuff. And this happened every year. Without this, the Jewish nation could never be sure that they weren't going to get sick, get poor, and die. It was very important that this get done every year correctly. And every once in a while, something would happen. The priest fall down, the goat wouldn't die enough, things like that. And it was a bad year for the Jews. And they'd just sit there holding tight until the next Yom Kippur showed up and they could try again. Okay, anybody offended yet? I'm looking at
No, but
Elizabeth.
how do you spell the name of that Estazel?
Azazel, I spell it A-Z-A-Z-E-L, A-Z-A-Z-E-L.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Yeah, these are things to look up. Okay, so
Yeah, Diana's
I'd
got it.
just like to make a quick comment. Sholem Ash, who wrote that wonderful book, The Nazarene and the Prophet,
Yeah,
and,
yeah.
Mary, he also wrote a book, Moses, and he described what you're talking about, that long journey out of Egypt and setting up, stuff. It's like setting up camp, staying there a few months, doing all this stuff,
Yeah,
moving on, setting up the camp again.
yeah.
Amazing. And he goes into all detail. And of course it's fiction, but and I don't know where he got his information, but it's a fabulous read. Totally fabulous.
Most of there's a ton of information lying around. And I'm surprised. I've actually talked to a bunch of rabbis about some of the stuff that I'm talking about. And they haven't heard of it. They haven't heard of it. And there's reasons why, and I'm going to get into those. Okay, next page. The holiest thing was the ark. It was the most important thing, and it was basically the heartbeat of the temple. So the ark was a big honking deal. Now, let's get in some facts about these Jews. First off, at this point, there was no way to convert to being a Jew. You had to have your mom be a Jew or you weren't a Jew. That's it. So when you talk about Jews, this is what I'm talking about. It was a tribe. It was tribal. It was related to the matriarchal lineage. I'm going to get into this. One of the things that Jews did was they cut off their foreskins as a sign of dedication to God. This comes into play later in my story, so I will mention it as something just to be aware of. Oh, death. Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. Another thing you needed the temple for was to deal with the impurity of touching someone or something that had touched someone or something that was dead. You were impure and could not go to the temple and take care of your sins as long as you had, until you had gotten a little dose of the blood of the red heifer. So if you touched a tent pole that had recently been touched by a guy who just died, you were impure and you couldn't go to the temple, and you were going to be facing all the retribution for your sins. So what you needed to do was find yourself a priest and say, sprinkle me with some of that red heifer blood. Now, what is the blood of the red heifer? It is a heifer that has been examined by the priests to show that it has all the hairs on its entire body are the same color. They get a maximum 2 hairs of a different color. And if they can find a heifer that passes this test, then they build a ramp that goes up to the side of the temple. They take the cow, walk it up to the edge of the temple, and then they cut off its head and they save the blood. Then the blood is stored and diluted and passed around from priest to priest to priest, so that they will have some blood of this red heifer to sprinkle on people who are impure from touching the dead. It's very important. And these red heifers, the priests were continually looking at red heifer candidates. They are so rare that they would look for red heifer candidates all the time, and they would find a red heifer, an actual red heifer, typically every 50 or 70 years. I don't know if you remember, the evangelical Christians were talking about trying to recreate the temple in Jerusalem. They actually set up genetic scientists in Jerusalem trying to figure out how to do artificial DNA to create a heifer that was all one hair color. Because if you didn't have the red heifer, you couldn't have a working, functioning temple. And their idea was, when the time comes, we need a red heifer, so we better start working on it now. And they were trying to scientifically create them. That's an interesting thing to me. Another thing that is useful to remember is the God of the Jews had no form. There was no, in all the other religions of the area, gods appeared in a form, typically a humanoid form. And there would be a temple with a statue of the god, and you could go to that place and you'd be sure the god was there, and you could make sacrifices and obeisance and all these things. It's a lot like, for most people, it's like a Hindu temple. It's a place to actually commune with a physical form of a god who you knew wasn't the actual god itself, but it was a manifestation of the god in a form. That didn't exist for the Jews. They didn't have a way of describing the God. They didn't have a picture of them. They didn't have any of that stuff. So it's a very different relationship that they had with God. They would not be doing things like they do in some temples of throwing dice to figure out futures or things like that. They relied on people they recognized as prophets who were actually getting information from their God. And then they would talk to those prophets and say, what's God saying these days? And the prophet would tell them. So they believed the prophets were getting direct information from God, and then they would go ahead and work based on that information. There was no place to worship their God except the big temple. There was no other place. You didn't like set up little places. You just went. You go to India, you see they got these little puja tables all around the place, lots of little god figures. They can worship there. Not with the Jews. They couldn't worship any place but the temple. So the temple was a key, not just the key element, it was the pivot point for the entire life of the entire nation every day. They were either out farming or growing a sheep and then taking it to the temple and killing it, or they were going out and getting wood. They were living a life that revolved around the temple. Okay. This group did not have a king. Unlike any other big group in this area, it was not a kingdom. They did not have a ruler. They did not have a hereditary ruler. The closest that they had to a ruler was a high priest, but it was not a political position. And as a result, there was no standing army. There were no predefined generals. There was no nothing. And they were prone to being attacked. And when they were attacked, they had no discipline for rules of war. They were bloodthirsty and they killed everything in sight. They were famous for being bloodthirsty. As a matter of fact, at that time, there were other countries that had mercenaries. They loved having Jewish mercenaries because they were like crazy killers. It was like perfect. But they were so deadly and so nasty and so bloodthirsty that basically everybody hated them. It was like, oh, I don't want to be around these people. They made themselves objects of hatred and they made themselves objects of concern to other nations that they wanted to contain them or move them away or wipe them out. So that's just how it was back in those days. When you hear about all the battles that they had with the Assyrians and the Philistines it's cause everybody's going like, let's get rid of these guys. Also, their idea was that they had been given basically everything in the area by God. So if somebody was in a place, like for example, the poor Canaanites, they went, oh, God gave us this, so we're killing you and then we'll take it. And they did that every place they went. They based their rationale on God's word. And so they did what they had been told, but it was not nice for the people they were doing it to. So the Jews were not liked, and they were constantly at war, trying to take on new territory that they believed they had been given by God, and the other countries coming and saying, oh, no, you're not doing that. And then lots of blood and guts passing through. Am I saying things okay? Is everybody okay with this so far? Oh, God, I'm going slow.
I do
All
have
right.
one question. Can I don't know.
Yes, I'm done. I'm ready to go to the next part. I got to go faster.
Is this what Moses told these folks to? Is this how Moses told them to live? The red heifer, and is this straight from?
Oh, it's all in the Bible. It's all in basically Deuteronomy and Leviticus.
But it's sanctioned by God, basically.
Oh, required.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. God forbid you go to a funeral home. You're in trouble. Everything that all the clothing that the dead person had on, all the bed clothes, everything needed to be purified. And you wanted to get to the temple. This is why they had those ritual baths, because you had to clean yourselves in order to go into the temple. And why'd you want to go into the temple? Because you were going to get sick, poor, and die. Okay, you couldn't pray your sins away. Okay, let's talk. We're going to move fast. We're going to go to Saul. So about 350 years after moving around and landing in Canaan, there was still no king, and the tribes had what they called judges, and the judges would do modest judging and assembling and leading, but there was no leader of the Jews at all. And as a result, there was no unified army, no unified response to attacks, no nothing. And the Jews were saying, hey, these guys are killing us all the time. Why doesn't somebody become a king? So they finally went to the prophet Samuel and said, give us a king. Find a guy, make him a king, and we'll all follow him around and dress alike. And so Samuel chose a bright, smart young guy, Saul, anointed him and made him a king. And sure enough, everybody joined up, agreed to follow him. He would lead armies. He was a great warrior and a great conqueror, and everything was good until Samuel told him to go and attack a bunch of people. And so Saul said, what do you want? What am I supposed to do? He says, go in there and kill everybody. Literally wipe them out. And Saul took his army, he went in, he said, you know, there's a lot of good farm animals here. I'm going to leave those. And there are these young kids, I'm going to leave them. And these old women, I'm not going to kill them, but I'm killing everybody else. And he came back, and Samuel was furious, absolutely furious. He said, did I tell you to wipe them all out? And Saul said, yeah, but cows. He said, I told you to wipe out everything. And he grabbed a horse and led a bunch of people from Saul's army back to the same battle area and wiped out all living things. And when he came back, he said, Saul, you and I are going to have a talk. I'm not so sure you're the guy we need to have be a king. So he began looking around for another candidate to be king, and he ran across David. So while Saul was still the anointed king of this nation, Samuel anointed David the king of the nation, even though David was like 15 years old at the time. And the stories of David and Saul are just amazingly weird. David singing in Saul's court, and Saul throwing spears at him and everything under the sun. And David keeps coming back. It's a strange relationship. And I highly advise you to read Samuel and Kings to take a look at some of the crazy stuff that went on. But eventually Saul died, and David became the king. And the first thing he did was to take the ark to Jerusalem, where he wanted to create a permanent place for the tabernacle, the temple and the tabernacle, which up to this time had still been pretty mobile. They left in the same place for a long time, but it was always just, you know, cloth and sticks holding it up. It was basically a big fancy tent. And he said, we're going to make it be an actual place. It'll always be there. We'll bury the sticks in the ground, put cement under them, everything like that. It'll be great. So he went and took this tabernacle to Jerusalem, having the ark marched in as he danced naked in front of it, going up the hill. And they took it to the Temple Mount, which is the mound, the hill where Adam is buried. That's why it's there. That's why it's important. Adam himself is buried there. And they put everything right on top of this one place, and they had a semi-permanent temple. And then David said, you know, I'm going to build a nice temple, like stone and stuff. But by the time he got around to saying that, God had not liked some of his unpleasant behavior and said, no, you're not. You're out of the temple business. We're going to wait for your son. Your son's got to be better. So he never got to build the temple, but his son Solomon built a temple. Now, here's the thing about Solomon. I pay attention to stuff like politics, okay? Solomon, unlike most of the Jewish leadership, was really smart, had been raised by outsiders, understood a little bit about politics, understood a little bit about how to get along, and he started making very good overtures to other kingdoms, saying, hey, you know that thing where we're the bloodthirsty Jews, we kill everybody? That's not happening now. Now we're the nice, peaceful Jews. Give us some money. So all these kings gave him a lot of money and made his beautiful temple a beautiful place and a beautiful city, because He was a peaceful king. And the people were so happy to get this. So we built a big stone temple, giant walls, beautiful tabernacle that extended into the sky. And one thing that I should mention is Shekinah, which is the Jewish sort of word for what Christians call the Holy Spirit, a feminized spirit of God. It's like God's hidden half. And Shekinah would appear in fire and smoke. So when Moses is talking to the burning bush, he's basically talking to the fire of Shekinah. And as Solomon was dedicating his temple, a cloud of fire came down from the sky and landed in the middle of the courtyard in front of his temple. And the fire and smoke slowly walked across the temple courtyard, up the steps into the tabernacle, went inside the tabernacle, and smoke and fire poured out of the upper windows of the tabernacle for a couple of weeks. And at that point, people thought, hey, this is really a great little temple thing we got here. This is kind of really interesting. So that kind of gave an authority to the temple at that point. Now, if I remember right, the chief priest of the temple at that time was a guy named Zadok. Zadok the priest, and his name shows up later. All right. Now I have another thing to tell you. This is not going to be pleasant. The temple had a stone floor. And unlike being out in the middle of the desert and killing a bunch of animals, the stone floor got bloody. And so they actually made a second floor above the stone floor so that the blood could drip down through. The temple was getting bigger and bigger in terms of activity. More and more animals were being slaughtered. The temple was basically a slaughterhouse. And if you think of it in those terms, I see you're shaking your head, Elizabeth. I'm talking about the practical thing, okay? Just lots of animals, lots of blood, lots of organs being tossed around, things like that. It's the same stuff that a slaughterhouse has to figure out. So they had to figure out how to create a pleasant area where animals are being killed all the time. One of the things that each sin had a specific sacrifice that was required to do it. There were also sacrifices of honor, burning typically wheat and things like that as gifts of thanks or praise to God. But I'm talking about sin sacrifices, which are always animals, sometimes little tiny pigeons and doves. Pigeons and doves, they're huge cages full of pigeons and doves. The priests come through, knock the head of the dove on the altar to break its neck, and they just toss it in the fire. It's a bizarre thing. And to us, it's bizarre, but I tell you, I've been in Hindu temples and stuff they do there is bizarre, but it's not bizarre to them. They've been given this mandate and they do it. So I just want to say this was how it worked. This is how it was. To get into the temple, there was a charge of 1 shekel, which is basically at that time like a penny. You had to show your sincerity by actually giving a gift to the temple to walk in and be part of it. So the shekel was just a small coin like a penny that was around at that time. And it was a nominal donation to the temple. Now, this comes up later. All right, I'm on to the next part. Any questions? Any insulting comments anybody wants to make? I'm ready for them.
Well, I think one of the problems with David was his relationship with Bathsheba.
Oh,
You know,
yeah.
And he killed a man so he could have her.
Yes.
And Solomon is actually the son of Bathsheba.
That part I didn't know, but I thought they got
Oh,
married.
yes. Yes, she made him come to her. David was obviously in love with her, and she was very beautiful. And she forced him to have her son be the king as opposed to any of the other sons of David.
Well, he was a pretty smart guy. When
And
you
she
actually
was
read,
very smart. And she was not Jewish. She was from a different group of people. So it was like,
interesting.
yeah, it's in the Bible, and I can't remember what she was, but it was a different tribe. It was like an alliance.
So I
But
read for enjoyment and I forget everything I read for enjoyment, and I write notes about stuff that I'm reading for a purpose. And I have, I remember reading this stuff at Elizabeth and going like, hey, that's a pretty cool story, but it didn't have the purpose of fitting into my narrative. So I didn't take notes. I totally
I do
lost
have
it. Thank you for
a
bringing it.
question,
Yeah.
if you can take it. If not, then you can go on. But I'm wondering what created these fiery clouds. There must have been some real scientific.
No, 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 no. This is what I had to learn as I was studying this stuff.
Okay.
People are constantly trying to create some sort of scientific, logical explanation for these events. And it's only when you stop looking at them that way and say, holy cow, the sun stopped in the middle of the sky while the battle was going on, and not try to figure out, well, whether they taking drugs? They thought it stopped, things like that. No, for them, it stopped. For them, it was Shekinah walking across the courtyard. You got to put yourself into their framework to really love it. So I totally ignore trying to do explanations. Totally. And just say, holy cow, did that happen too? Wow. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. And I highly recommend that. Just a sense of wonder and surprise at what these people experienced. And they experienced enough that they told other people about it, and nobody said, nah, it didn't happen. Because we're going to get into one in a couple of minutes that also is a little crazy sounding, and it's wonderful. It's wonderful. Okay, next, Babylon and the temple. So one of the things about Solomon's heirs, the kings that followed Solomon, and even Solomon himself, they would lose the thread and they would bring idols of other gods into the temple courtyard and worship them there. And God didn't like it very much. So when this happened, suddenly all shit would break loose for the Jews. There'd be armies coming in, hailstones, fire, everything under the sun. And it was only when the next king came in and said, we're getting rid of all these idols. They're nothing but trouble. Look at us. We repent. We are trying to get better. We're going to be better, God. Really, stop doing all the plague of frogs. Until the next king, at which point another set of idols would come in and more trouble, and then a good king and a bad king, a good king and a bad king, one right after the other. And eventually things got so bad that the Babylonians, who were a big honking nation, decided they had had enough of these Jews, and they came in and destroyed the temple and Jerusalem. They knocked down the tabernacle building. They bounced down the temple walls. They wrecked Jerusalem. And then they gathered up 40,000 people who'd been living in Israel and took them to Babylon to be slaves. And there were still about 8 or 10,000 left in the old area, but they never got to those. So 40,000 people went to Babylon to be slaves. Excuse me. And when they got there, nothing happened. The Babylonians suddenly were so at work trying to fight the Persians who were coming after them very hard that they just left the Jews alone. The Jews were there basically under guard, but not doing anything. They weren't being slaves. They were trying to grow their own food and take care of business and things like that. And they also had no temple. The temple had been destroyed. And now they're wondering, wait a minute, our whole lives are revolving around this thing that isn't there. What are we doing? We're spinning out of control. So they began to ask questions. They began, oh, and I should mention one thing here. I apologize. I made this note to mention it. In advance of the Babylonian destruction of the temple, the prophet Jeremiah predicted that the Babylonians were going to come. And he hid the temple treasures. He hid the ark and the menorah and the showbread table and everything he could. And so the Babylonians didn't get it right away, thanks to Jeremiah. This comes in later. So the 40,000 Jews in Babylon are going like, hey, I wonder why we got destroyed. This is really something to think about. And they began to puzzle it out. And one of the things they thought is, well, maybe we broke a bunch of laws. And somebody said, oh, yeah. And then they discovered that every tribe and every group had a different oral tradition about what the laws were. Very differing. And as a group, they decided that they were going to codify and organize the laws. So they got together and they started organizing all this stuff. And one of the things they realized is, wait a minute, we should write this stuff down. And they also had no common alphabet or common language to write it in. Hebrew was done differently every place you went. So they created a standardized Hebrew alphabet. And they began to write down the laws and the histories, and that became the first 5 books of the Torah. So that's when the Torah was written. The Torah was written in roughly, let me see if I remember, 550 BCE. It does not go back to Moses. It's a relatively recent origin comparatively. Yeah, you didn't know that. I'm sorry. It's true. You can look it up. The other books like Kings, Samuel's, Chronicles, things like that were written after there was standardized Hebrew. So everything in the Old Testament or the Tanakh is of much more recent origin than back to the time of Moses. Yeah, that's true. Now, the oral tradition existed, but the written Torah did not. Now, while they were trying to figure out about disobeying stuff, the priests were no longer priests of anything. And so other people came up and said, hey, I got ideas too. You aren't priests, so you're priests. Fine, you don't have anything to be priests for. Let's talk about life with God. So they began to have these discussions about what went wrong, what should have been done. And one of the big discussions were these laws that were in the Torah designed only for the priestly class or for everybody? And the priestly class, who called themselves the Zadoks in honor of Solomon's high priest, the Zadok, said, oh, it's just for the priests. It's up to us. And we screwed up. I'm saying we screwed up. We weren't following the laws, hence the temple was destroyed. Whereas there are a bunch of other intellectual smarty pantses who said, no, it was for everybody. We should have all been following these laws, and we didn't, so it's up to everybody. And they actually had discussions like this. Now, while all these discussions were going on, while the Torah was being written down, the Persians conquered Babylon. And unlike the Babylonians, who were kind of stupid, saying, let's have another 40,000 slaves, the Persians had a different approach to conquered countries. They said, let's put these guys to work and tax them to death. So they wanted to keep the people they conquered in place and just levy big taxes on them. So when they looked at 40,000 people standing around saying, we're supposed to feed these guys, they said, hey, how'd you like to go back to Jerusalem? They sent the Jews back to Jerusalem, and they offered them some money. They said, hey, we'll help you rebuild your temple, which they did. They gave them money for the temple. We'll help you rebuild Jerusalem. So Nehemiah went there and built the new walls around Jerusalem. And they said, hey, by the way, we found a bunch of your old temple stuff. We got the menorah. We got the table of showbread. We got the lavers and the altars. And when they were telling us, oh, what about the ark? No, we don't have the ark. He said, oh, I don't know if we can do anything anyway, because the eternal fire that we were supposed to never let go out, we didn't bring it with us. The fire went out. I don't even know how we could go back to the temple without the fire. And he said, well, we also found these jars, which are real interesting, which we think were taken by the prophet Nehemiah. He put fire into the jars. And they'd have these large jars, and when they opened them up, the jars would burst into flame. And they said, this is the temple fire. So they felt like they could go back and restart the temple with this fire. The name for this fire is naphtha, which is where we get words like naphthalene, which to me is very interesting. Okay, so Cyrus sent everybody back to Jerusalem. And now we're going to have them go back they created a temple. And they started up doing everything again. So I'm done with the part. Does anybody have a question?
Right, what did you say that fire is called?
Naphtha, Naphtha.
Okay.
I have a
Pete, oh, Barbara's telling you the right version. Naphtha, right? Naphtha.
I think it's Naphtha.
Okay, I don't know. Put it in Google, Google will correct it for you.
I have a question about the eternal light. Like when I grew up, the eternal light was this little light that was in the middle of the top
Yeah.
of the ark. But I hear you saying, if I'm right, that actually it was the lights in the 7-branch menorah.
No, not necessarily.
They need to know what
They-
a menorah is.
well,
'Cause
they-
they think it's got candles.
It has oil. It's the menorah had oil lamps.
Yeah.
But the idea was that when they were carrying the ark from place to place, they were also carrying fire. The fire from the last place the fire had been. It was the fire that they would use to relight the fire in the altar. They'd use it to relight the lamp, the menorah. It was just a basic thing. And when they moved, they'd say, hey, let's get some fire, put it in the bowl, carry it with us. So they would carry this fire. The same fire that Moses started was the fire that was in the temple all the time. The temple fire for Solomon was the same fire that Moses had started. And so that was the connection to the ancient temple, was the fire. And that's why the Jews were so upset when they realized they didn't have fire to start the new temple. And don't forget that the way God manifests as spirit in these days is as fire. Okay, the God came in two forms at this time. There was a weather god who would make nasty stuff happen with weather. Okay, floods, Nile floods, Noah's Ark, rain, storms, this, that. The God that is basically showing up in the Old Testament, when God shows up, is a weather god. No form, just weather. And he speaks in thunder. He speaks through the thunder, things like that, okay? But there was this other form that he had, which was a fire. And the fire shows up in the burning bush. It shows up in the lights in the menorah and other things like that. It's not highly looked at, but you know, one of these Kabbalists, the Jewish mystics, they're big fans of the fire aspect of God. They're big fans because it's feminine to them. And I told you I wasn't getting into religion and philosophy. Everything I'm talking about is social political stuff, but it's just interesting when you think about it. Okay.
Jay,
When they got,
can I just say, if your sense is, I don't want you to feel like you have to cram everything in. No, we could, if you're up for it, we could schedule another time to continue, or so that's all. I just want to give,
hey, I'm on a roll and I'm almost halfway done.
all right.
I'm going to try and be briefer. Okay. Now, at this time, a couple hundred years later, Alexander conquers the world. And he conquers it, and by God, did he conquer the world. And he changed everything. He spread Greek culture everywhere. He created governments. He created societies. He kicked out the societies that were there and created new leadership, new governments, new styles. Everybody had to speak Greek like that. When he died, his generals divided up the world. They basically just drew 6 lines. And 2 of the lines are very important to this story. One of them is the Seleucids, who got what's now sort of like giant modern Syria, including all the northeastern areas of the old USSR, Yugoslavia, and a bunch of other places. And the other side were the Ptolemies, and they got everything in Egypt and Africa. So if you think about Egypt south of Jerusalem and Syria north of Jerusalem, Jerusalem was like the dividing line, and both sides hated the fact that there was a dividing line, and that whichever one got didn't have Jerusalem wanted it. So these 2 kingdoms would battle all the time over Jerusalem, but they never battled in Jerusalem. They battled all around outside of it. And at a certain point, the Seleucids took over Jerusalem. And Seleucus III, I think, it might be Seleucus IV, who was the emperor of the Syrians, decided, hey, there are all these temples in my kingdom, and a lot of them have a lot of money, and I could use money. So he began the process of looting the temples and taking all their money. And eventually thought, hey, there's a big old temple in Jerusalem. I'm going to go loot that thing. And he sent a general to Jerusalem with 40 empty carts and an army. And they marched into the temple courtyard and said, we want all the money. We want the treasury. And at that point, the high priest is standing in front of the doorway to the tabernacle. And in the tabernacle, suddenly 2 angels appear. Now, angels were part of, I forgot to mention the Persians. Okay, back during the Babylonian times, the group that was fighting intellectually with the Zadoks had gotten involved with the Persians and begun discussing the similarities of the Persian religion with Judaism. And these are very similar religions, except for a few factors. And here are the few factors. The Persians believed in an afterlife. The Persians believed in a last judgment. The Persians believed in bodily resurrection. And the Persians believed in humanoid angels with wings and halos. Now, the angels in the Old Testament that show up, except in 1 or 2 cases where they appear as actual men, are basically weird, formless things or things with wings and eyes all over the place. They aren't angels in the way we think of them with wings and halos. But what showed up at the temple inside the tabernacle were those angels, the ones with wings and halos and light pouring out of them and everything like that. And they came out and confronted this general. And he was brave enough to not move back until a giant horse with a giant horseman carrying a flaming sword came dashing out of the tabernacle, down the stairs, and started waving the sword at him. And at that point, the guy said, I've had enough. I'm getting out of here. Their God is too strong. He turned around, went back to Antioch, where he came from, didn't stop, rode night and day, went into the castle, the palace, went up to the king and stabbed him and killed him on the spot. Now, this caused a little disturbance in the kingdom, and the king had a son and the king had a brother, and the brother grabbed the son and took him away and sort of talked to him and set him and said, you're the real king now. You should be the king. Here's what you do. And he convinced the son to go in and stab that guy, that general, and kill that guy. So now the son was the new king. Now, the uncle turns out not to be a very pleasant person, and he slowly poisoned the son. So in about 9 or 10 months, the son died mysteriously, and they put the uncle, who had been the son's regent, to make him the king. So this new king, Antiochus, took the name Antiochus Epiphanes, God in human form on earth. And he said, my brother Seleucus had like the right idea, but he didn't go about it right. And he began to parley with the high priest of the temple. Now, at that time, there was a governor. Jerusalem was a colony of either Syria or Egypt all the time, but they had no other government leadership. The closest thing to a political organization was the priesthood, and the high priest was recognized as the leader of the priesthood that had some influence on the Jews. So Antiochus began to schmooze with the high priest, and he didn't get very far. So he began to schmooze the high priest's brother and said, how would you like to be high priest? And the brother made a deal with Antiochus. He said, I know you guys want a lot of money in the temple. Here's what if we send you 800 talents a year of silver? Now, a talent is 70 pounds of silver. Hey, we're talking about sending basically 3 tons of silver a year to Antiochus. Antiochus, yeah, okay, that's fine. I'll make you high priest. So we went down to the Gerontium, the council of the elders, and said, remember that priest, that high priest you have? He's not the high priest anymore. His brother's now the high priest. And they said, no, we didn't elect that guy. And they said, yeah, you're going to elect him now. So they made the brother the high priest. And every year he would send these cartloads of silver out of Jerusalem. And the Jews of Jerusalem going, oh, look at all this stuff he's sending up there. They were very upset, but they didn't do anything about it. And that went on for a while until the new high priest had an assistant who went to Antiochus Epiphanes and said, hey, the 800 talents of silver? I'll give you 800 talents of gold a year. 3.5 tons of gold. Now, when the wagons are getting ready and they're putting gold on the wagons and taking it up to Antioch, everybody's like really upset and furious. But Antiochus is making a lot of dough, and he is anxious to go down to Egypt and conquer Egypt. So he goes and puts together a big army and goes down through Jerusalem to go and conquer Egypt. And as he comes through, the assistant, now the new high priest, Menelaus, gets everybody out to cheer. They do literally the Palm Sunday thing, which you probably have heard about, where they put the palms on the street, and Antiochus they're all waving and shouting, we love Antiochus, which they don't, because Antiochus has taken all the gold out of the temple. But they're pretending, and Antiochus walks through and says, hey, these guys are great. I love these guys. What a bunch of swell guys. And he goes down to conquer Egypt. And at that time, there was a smallish country in Europe that was starting to make a little noise, and that country was Rome. I'm going to stop for a second because Ralph Jackson has got a hand up. Ralph, are you there? Is that intentional?
Yeah, and wait until the next break, if you like.
Can anybody
I
understand
can
him?
sit on it.
Oh, go ahead
Can
and
you
answer.
hear me? Ask, okay. Well, for a minute I was lost. Now we're talking like
This
sort of
is
like how long after Alexander now?
about 200 years. The time
So
is
familiar with, yeah, Jay,
164 to 167 167 to 164 BCE.
oh yeah, that's getting later on. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I
Okay.
wasn't aware of how the history went after Alexander and after
Alexander died around 300 BCE.
the history I'm familiar with regarding the rebuilding of Jerusalem after the who were the bad guys?
The Babylonians, yeah, that
The
happened about 150
Babylonians was hinged on Cyrus, and then after
Yes,
him, Xerxes was a key figure, and I
yes,
guess that like took us a couple of hundred years after Cyrus. But
yes,
anyway,
yes.
I'm caught up. I'm good. Okay,
Yeah,
thanks. Yeah,
Alexander conquered the Persians. That was the last big thing he did.
yeah.
Okay, so here's Antiochus going down to Egypt. He's going to go into Egypt, and out of nowhere comes the new ally of Egypt, the Romans. And they say, hey, we're working with the Egyptians now. And a single horseman rides out to meet Antiochus's massive army. One Roman horseman. He gets off his horse and says, you do not want to do this. Antiochus says, oh, yeah, I do. And the Roman says a couple other times, you do not want to do this. And Antiochus says, I'm doing it. And the Roman says, this is such a bad idea. I want you to reconsider. And he draws a line in the sand and says, if you step across this line, you will face the consequences. And Antiochus stood and looked at that line for 6 or 8 hours and finally decided, we're turning around. So he turned around and started going back to Jerusalem. Now, in those days, news traveled slow. The fact that Antiochus had turned around, got to Jerusalem literally like a day or two before Antiochus got to Jerusalem. But the news that got to Jerusalem was that Antiochus had been killed, and the Jerusalem was having a festival of delight. Good riddance. He went in and everybody's dancing and singing. He says, what's this about? He says, oh, that guy Antiochus got killed. We're so happy. And he said, yeah, I'm not. And he decided that the Jews needed to not be Jews anymore. He wasn't going to kill them all. He killed a whole bunch right then. And then he said, what we really need to do is get rid of this nasty religion where people think they know what they're doing. They need leadership, and they get their leadership from some god and prophets. This is not a good idea. So he began to systematically destroy the Jewish religion. Now, at this time, because Alexander had been the leader of the world, almost everybody in the rich parts of Jerusalem spoke Greek, acted Greek, things like that. Oh, I did forget to mention that when Antiochus began to fund the temple and had established Menelaus and I forget the guy's name, as the high priests. He also said, I want to make some nice things happen in the temple. So he built a gymnasium in the temple courtyard. And because they loved him so much for all the good stuff he was doing, Menelaus built a statue of Zeus that was designed to look just like Antiochus, to be worshipped in the temple courtyard. So remember I said about putting idols in the temple never being a good idea? This was not a good idea. The priests at that time were so happy about going and taking baths and exercising and getting oiled up and massaged and everything in the gymnasium that they forgot to actually do the actual sacrifices and worship acts that needed to be done at the temple. There were times when the Holocaust, the morning and evening Holocaust, never took place because the priests were all hanging around the gymnasium. The everything in Jerusalem of the important things that were happening were being done by people who spoke Greek, who were trying to be Greek, people who were literally men who were literally trying to stretch what was left of their foreskins so they looked more Greek. And you can actually see the little gizmos they tried to use, little weights and things. I'm sorry, it's true. And at this point, Antiochus made it a rule that everybody in his nation, this nation that he owned, Judea or Israel or whatever it was calling itself at that point, no Torahs, no circumcisions. Everybody had to eat pork to prove that they were not avoiding pork. And people, these Greekish Jews, just stood up and said, where's the next bite of ham? I'm up for it. They leaped at this stuff because all the money, all the riches, all the power was in Antiochus. Out in the countryside, I think I mentioned that the babies who got circumcised, the punishment was they tied the baby to around the neck of the mother. They took the mother to the top of the temple wall and kicked them off the temple wall. It was pretty nasty stuff. And Antiochus pretty much did all these things in Jerusalem, kill anybody who didn't obey, and then went out into the countryside. And this is where he met the soldiers he was sending out there, met some guy named Mattathias, who was of the priestly class, a Levite, living out in the country. And they got everybody in the village in a line and started trying to feed them pork. And some old guy just said, I'm not doing it. And they came up to him. People would come in and say, just pretend. Just pretend. Here's a piece of chicken. Just chew on that when they give you the pork. He wouldn't do it. And because he wouldn't do it, a soldier came by and killed him. And Mattathias took his staff and killed the soldier. And then he said, anyone who still loves the Lord and obeys the law, follow me. And took whoever was with him out into the hills to get away from the Seleucids who were doing all this nasty. And slowly, more and more people began to leave the towns of the countryside and come and join him in the hillside. And they set up little camps and little encampments. And the Seleucids would sometimes, it's a hilly place. You had to know where you were going. So the Seleucids would follow them around, try to find them. And when they found them, they would kill them. And they had a tough time doing this. And then they discovered that on the Sabbath day, all these people would figure out how to get to a cave, and they go into the back of the cave and they'd sit there for the entire day. They didn't want to do anything to disturb the Sabbath. And the Seleucids said, oh, so we didn't have to do anything except wait for Sabbath day, find the cave, and then burn everybody in the cave. They don't even go. They don't even come out. And when Mattathias heard about this, he said, no, you're going to have to leave. You're going to have to get out. You're going to have to fight. And they said, but it's the Sabbath. And his response was, what good is a Sabbath if there's nobody left to honor it? And so there was some little attempt to get away at that point. And eventually Mattathias died. And when he died, his son Judas or Judah or Yehuda was appointed as the leader. And the difference between Mattathias and Yehuda is that Yehuda was a bit of a warrior. And he said, here's the thing we're going to do now. We're going to fight back. So these country Jews with pitchforks and scythes and sticks and whatnot began to attack the largest, most well-equipped army on earth. They would figure out how to find them when they didn't know what was going to happen. They did guerrilla warfare. They became quite adept at getting victories over this army. It became such a thing because they were so ferocious and so bloodthirsty, as typical of their history, that the Seleucids began to avoid him. Eventually, Judah went and surrounded Jerusalem, and he got it under his control. There was a garrison in place in Jerusalem, and the garrison said, take it. We're not doing anything. It's yours. So they just sat there while Judah began to come back and take control of Jerusalem. And when they finally got to the temple and went into the temple, they discovered that it was horrible. That everything in the world that the Seleucids could think of to show how absolutely non-Jewish they were had been done to the temple. They smeared pig's shit on everything. They wrecked everything. They had put something where the ark was supposed to be in the middle of the tabernacle, something called the abomination of desolation. I think I mentioned this. No one even knows what the hell it was. No one who saw it wants to describe it. I have no idea what it was, but God knows it affected people a lot. It affected them so much they couldn't stand to be there. The fighting Maccabees. Maccabee is a name that means hammer, and it was a nickname for Judah, the hammer, and his followers took it on. They said, we're all Maccabees, we're all hammers. So that was the team name. So the Maccabees were so disgusted by what they saw that they couldn't even stand to be in the place. They went to the hill across the way, the Mount of Olives, and they just sat there praying, covering themselves with ashes, wearing sackcloth for a few days, trying to figure out what they were going to do. And eventually they decided, we're going to go back and clean the place up. And then they decided, after cleaning the place up, which took the better part of a year, and you can just imagine the women and men going through this place and just trying to scrub off all the stuff that had been done, not just the pig shit, but the evil of the people who had smeared the pig shit. It must have been a task and a half trying to figure out how to actually restore it to holiness, which they thought they could do. And after a year, they thought they had the place clean enough. They thought they had a menorah that would work. They thought they had a showbread table. They were getting wood. They were doing the things that Moses had set in place for his little temple machine to keep going. And they were restoring all those elements. And they decided that they would try to restart the temple. Now, Judah, because he was a Levite, was a priest. He had the ability to be the priest who actually did the work of being the high priest of the temple. He wasn't elected, but he was acting in effect as a high priest. Now, one of the things that I find interesting is for 300 years at this point, there had been no ark. There was nothing that made this temple like the prime holy place. There was no way to go in and sprinkle the goat's blood and see the face of God. There was no way to assure that God was going to take care of his people because Yom Kippur had been done properly. They'd just been working through it like, okay, we'll just go through the motions. The high priest during this period would go in after where the ark would have been and sprinkled the goat's blood where the ark would have been. Like, yeah, there you go. So there's kind of an emptiness. And now they're trying to restart the temple
And God has left the building. I mean, God hasn't been there. God let people smear pig shit all over his house. They're starting to wonder what they're doing. And it's at this point that they're like ready to start stuff up. They know they got this bunch of oil. They're going to light the menorah. They're going to start up the temple again. We don't have the sacred fire, but we got fire. We don't have the old menorah, but we got a menorah. We're going to do it. It'll be fine. It'll be fine. And then to find out that this store of bottles of olive oil that had been sanctified in front of the menorah, the oil they used to light the menorah, sanctified oil, to find that although it was sealed, all the seals had been broken. They had nothing. They had no fire. They had no ark. They had cheap stuff they had made up to replace the treasures like the menorah and the showbread table. It was all nothing. Somebody found a flask of oil that had not been unsealed. And then the decision, which must have been a tough decision, one flask of oil, not enough to keep things going. No presence of God, just these sad people. Defeated. Well, they lit the menorah with that oil and thought, well, we did our best. So this is the miracle. That God that had been their God for 2,000 years, that God of instant retribution, of no forgiveness, just do it or die, that God forgave them and showed his new form of compassion by keeping the lamps of the menorah lit for 8 days without oil. This isn't just good enough. I will make it holy. So what I celebrate with Hanukkah is the change of God from a harsh, cruel, angry weather god into the God of compassion that began to manifest and met its fruition in the next avatar, who changed the world into a place that was more concerned about compassion. Hanukkah is the miracle of the sign of redemption. And that's what this is all about. No matter how bleak it is, no matter how impossible it is, no matter how far you've gone, if you don't have the flame, God will provide the match. That's what I celebrate. And I'm done. Jay Bob. Do I have time for questions? Yes. Anybody got any comments?
Beautiful, Jay. I want to say that was
Wonderful presentation. My gosh, it's wonderful.
That was just terrific. Every time you tell it, I like it.
I'm sorry that,
You've waited for years to go on to hear this story that you love.
yes,
It's
I'm
really
so
amazing. It's
happy
such a
you,
gift to you.
if you want to read the book's online. If you want to hear the audio version, it's not as good because all the good stuff's in the footnotes. I tell all the little twists and turns in the footnotes, but if you want to hear the audio version, that's there too.
holy. Yeah.
And if it matters with the audio version, I start with Abraham.
Mhm. I have just a short question. What's the name of that table? You said the shore something or other.
Show bread.
How do you
It's not-
spell that?
It's not
That's
a foreign word.
It's two words. Show, like let's put on the TV show, and bread, like let's eat some bread. Show bread.
So
And it was
SHO or SHOW?
SHOW.
It's
And
where you display the bread.
yeah, and each of the tribes would make a loaf of bread every day to take to the temple. They take out the last 12 loaves, put up the new 12 loaves. It was just a way of showing we're doing this stuff, we're working for God, we're in place.
Uh-huh. I didn't realize that I thought in either Deuteronomy or Leviticus, the tribes were given duties, like some were musicians, some were the metal makers, some were the cloth makers, like you said, some decorated. I didn't realize it was rotational. And I knew the Levites were the only ones who could be the priests and handle the priestly functions. And I actually think Moses learned how, I think it was Moses, learned how to distribute responsibility when he left Egypt and he got married. And the father of his wife, I can't think of his name right now, but told Moses he was running himself into the ground and that he should distribute the power and have the one person from each tribe take responsibility for the smaller decisions, and then Moses would manage the large decisions as the judge, and that's what they started doing. But it was I'm trying to remember the guy's name who was the father of his wife, and he and his wife were separated for a number of years while he was going back and forth to Egypt and bringing the Jewish people out, etc.
Well, he was, I know the thing about you're talking about different tribes having different like focuses.
Yeah.
But in terms of the temple duties rotated, not their livelihoods or things like that. Okay. So like bringing in wood would be one tribe for a month. Then the next month, the wood for the altar, another tribe bring it in. Things like that.
And
There,
that's in Leviticus or Deuteronomy.
I don't know where I read it, but I think that's where I read it.
So I've read all of these things in the Bible and studied it a lot. I don't remember the rotational aspect. I do remember each, but I mean, you're probably right. I just haven't read it recently, so I can't say. But my understanding was whatever is that each tribe had a specific type of thing that was like a talent that they had,
Yeah.
whether it's music or artisanry or different things. But I didn't think it rotated on a monthly basis. I thought it was just their duty.
It would, I'm only talking about temple duties and temple tasks.
Okay,
Okay.
well, I guess I better look it up again.
Okay. Good luck.
Yeah, do you know which book it's in?
I will look it up. Don't count on it.
I'm just curious.
Jay, I'd like you to tell us the name of your book and where we can get it, where it can be up. Is it Amazon or?
I wrote up my giant novel is still something I'm working on, but I wrote up a lot of my notes because I was learning a lot of stuff and I didn't want to forget it all. And I wrote the notes up as kind of like this talk in a book called 8 Nights, which you can look at on 8nights.net.
Oh, great.
Is that
Is it-
8 the number or 8 spelled out?
Either way, I got both of them. 8 Nights or 8 Nights. I just go, just anything. You can even look it up on Google.
Mhm.
It's like it's like the third thing that shows up for 8 Nights.
Mhm.
And some people have the paper copy.
Whoa, check it out.
Yoo-hoo!
You gave it to me because I was bugging you at one of the Sahavises. And at some point, I think out of frustration and to make me shut up, you just gave it to me.
Oh, you know me too well, Diana.
I have another question for you, if I may ask it, unless
Yeah.
somebody else has a question.
I have
This
one.
is, oh, you go ahead then, and I'll ask after you.
What happened to the Ark of the Covenant and what was in it?
The Ark of the Covenant never showed up again, which is how come you can watch Raiders of the Lost Ark. But it's my contention that it's hidden underneath the temple, the Temple Mount, someplace, and that the waters and roots of the underground have now become part of the ark, and that it is spread everywhere. So that's my contention. That's how I'm going to end my book. And that's what I think happened.
What was in it?
Oh, the 10 Commandments, the 10 Commandment stones that Moses broke when he was so angry about the golden calf. The rod of Aaron that Aaron used to wave around to tell everybody what to do. And some manna, which is the food stuff that appeared in the desert when everybody was hungry.
And by the
way,
way, that rod or that staff was the one that he used to tap on the rock to get water when the Jewish people were hungry wandering in the desert. And it was also the one that that would turn into a snake that Moses used in Egypt. And it was also used, there's another thing that Aaron or Moses did with it as well. But it did lots of things.
so here's the thing, Elizabeth,
Yeah.
you're sitting there going, you're totally good with the snake rod. You're totally good with the water. And you're
Yeah.
sitting there going like, what about this fire stuff? Did that have a natural explanation?
Well, I just have an active mind. I was just curious. I was wondering how that could happen. So it was a fiery cloud that led them. I didn't realize it was something coming out of the ark, but I knew
It
that
actually came out of the ark.
the fiery cloud led, and created smoke by day, so it protected them, and by night it created the light, so they could see the way. I knew that, but I've never seen it connected to the ark before. Like, I guess it is in the Bible, right?
Yes, it is.
I've never
They got-
seen that.
They
It
got
never
the four men who carried it on their shoulders, led the entire group.
Yes.
And so that's how they went. They took the ark. The ark was the first thing in. And the ark would show up in the battles with the Philistines.
Right.
Well, they would bring out the ark and stuff would come out. The Philistines get scared, die right in place. The Philistines at one point said, enough, let's go capture the ark and use it ourselves. So they managed to capture the ark and they took it to Philistinia or whatever the place is called. And they took it to the temple of one of their gods and left it there. And the next day, all the priests of that temple woke up with tumors all over their body.
Wow.
And they said, get this sucker out of here. So they took it someplace else, the next temple. 2 days later, at that temple, all the priests have tumors all over their body. And they couldn't figure out how to get it far away enough, fast enough. And they finally put it on a driverless cart and sent it back to the Jews
they had made as a offering of penance little golden tumors, which they scattered over the top of the ark so that people could take the gold and maybe not be so mad at them for stealing the ark. They were terrified of the ark. It was quite a thing.
Well, it was interesting to me how, okay, so I've been raised in the Presbyterian tradition, studied the Bible, been to church, all that stuff, every Sunday of my life for years and years and years. So I'm very familiar with the Bible. And, so what was I going to say? I just lost this. I heard somebody else say something. Well, I can't remember what I was going to say just then. But the other question I had is, I didn't realize Adam was buried on the Temple Mount.
Yes. Also, when Ezekiel went to heaven in his little fiery chariot, supposedly he
Right.
left from the Temple Mount.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
And is that where the transcendence took place, the transfiguration as well?
I don't know about that. That's Christian stuff. I didn't get that far. I'm a Christian by training. So my dad was a minister. So I'm like you. I've read everything 50 times, but I never went back and scoured it. And
Yeah.
for my study, anything that happened after 160 BCE is of no interest because Judah was dead. So
Oh, yeah.
that's as far as I took it.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about that was early on in your presentation was about the Moguls. And I've done a lot of reading about Genghis Khan and his sons and grandsons and how they ran things and whatever. And some of his progeny were founders of the
The
Mogul
Mughal Empire. Yeah.
Empire. And there was a lot of horrible destruction created by Genghis Khan and his sons and the infighting, etc. And I can't remember. I think it was like grandson level, which is it's grandsons and one generation later that everything started falling apart, and fighting each other and some of the worst things happening, like in the area that became where the Moguls, northern India. And I just wondered if you got into that part of the history.
The part I start with is with Babar or Babar or whatever his name
Barbar,
is.
yeah.
He was the first emperor of what was called the Moguls. And he came out of, where did the hell did he come out of? Not Pakistan, some northern kingdom. And then he went into India. But he was very
It's not
influential.
Baluchistan, but it's one of those
One of those
well known.
One of those little stands. And he went and moved south farther and farther into India. And actually the whole the Ahmednagar area is an astonishing place of history of the stories of the Moguls. And
Really?
Wow. Yeah. You ever been to Ellora?
Oh, yes. And I've also been to the Pleasure Palace, which is a Mogul palace with the swimming pool, La Piscine, and then the well that's 200 feet below and the elephants drew up the water. That's really fascinating.
Yeah, there's a lot. It is an amazing place for the interaction of the Moguls, the Muslim Moguls, and the Hindus. And there's all kinds of stuff to look at. And nobody ever goes away from the Pilgrim Center. And I'm like jumping into cars and saying, hey, let's go see that place now. So yeah.
Yeah, I've done what you've done. I've been to all the sites of the Perfect Masters except for the one in Rajasthan or wherever Juden Baba was. I can't remember if it was Rajasthan or it was someplace way north. It's hard to get to.
Diana has a hand up, and
sorry, Diana.
And we are we have about 5 minutes maybe running. And Jay, I just wanted to express my incredible gratitude. This has just been wonderful. Wonderful.
I'm just amazed Diana came back. She's already heard it once.
Oh, many times. Okay, this is my question. My source for the life of Moses is, as I've mentioned already, a novel written by Sholem Asch.
Yes.
And he tells how at the end of Moses's life, he was not strong. He was failing. And he was writing. He was writing and writing and writing and writing. And as I was reading, I was thinking, by connecting that with something I had read elsewhere, that he was writing the Torah, the laws. But you're saying, no, that came later. So
No,
what do you
please,
think he
hang
was
on a
writing?
second, hang on a second. I maybe misled you. The actual written Torah that is still in place today was written in standardized Hebrew from a collection of the best understandings of the oral traditions, and that was done in about 550 BCE. The laws existed. Everybody was trying to follow the laws, but they varied in their expression. Somebody says this, another person says the same thing, but a slightly different way. What's the actual law? And you had a bunch of people saying, let's figure this one out. So that's the Torah that I'm talking about, not the actual, not the law itself, but the actual standardized written version.
So then, in fact, he was giving, because he was creating a system, for want of any other word, by which the Jews of that time could lead the correct life, the life for God.
Yes, yes.
And it's all
And
from
clearly,
him.
if you read Deuteronomy and Leviticus and these books of the law, they're just jam-packed. I mean, the specifics of what the menorah has to look like, what the showbread table has to be made of, everything's detailed in just enormous details.
And
And it's so complex and so it drives a guy like me nuts. Like, yeah, pretty good's okay. No, it's got to be exact.
You know, the other thing, some of
may I speak of it? One other thing I want to say about this. From that book and the way Moses was presented, I saw he's a perfect master. Minimum.
Certainly,
Yeah.
certainly.
God spoke through him.
As I told you when I got started, I paid no attention to spiritual stuff with this story.
Yeah.
I was only looking at political social. And I mean, Moses was Moses. I don't care if he was perfect master or another avatar or whatever. He was one honking great figure. Fantastic. I just give him props. I don't need to have a name for him.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jay. Wow. Do you have more to say? Could we do this again?
Sure. How about 2 hours? We'll be all set. I'm ready to get caffeinated again.
Another time. Awesome. This has just been so interesting. Thank you so much.
Thank
Sure.
you, Jay.
Thank you for asking.
Diana, what's the author of that book you were talking about?
Sholem Asch,
Can you spell that?
Asch.
Didn't Baba say that his book, The Nazarene, closely described the real?
And I think he gave it to Erich to read.
It's an excellent book.
Yeah.
And what was the first name of Asch?
Sholem is his first name. Sholem.
Thank you.
Asch. And he writes in Yiddish, so it has to be translated into English.
Which it
Oh.
is. I've seen
Which
them.
it is.
Yeah, it is. Right.
I don't read Yiddish.
All right, folks, I'm going to stop this recording again with great gratitude to you, Jay, for just a delightful couple of hours. And we will move on to Artie. Jay Baba.
Jay Baba.